that I've already spilled it, but I still think we could use maps to do this. When we talk about looking at world cities here, we're looking at cities, urban population, according to the UN in 2018, 55% of the world's population was living in an urban area. So you would look at this and you'd go, well, clearly she's probably in one of the good possibilities, she's in one of those cities. And then you're listening to my accent, or you're watching my hand gestures, or you're listening to me and you're going, okay, how can we even narrow it down further? You're going to say, well, she's probably in the United States. So when we look at this map, we see major metropolitan areas. We can look at definitely this proportional size map, and we can see where people are located. And now I did tell you that I was in Illinois, in Glen Ellen, Illinois, which probably doesn't mean a lot to you, but here's what I'll tell you. 80% of the population of the United States, roughly, lives in an urban area, okay? So we'll keep narrowing it down. Well, the good state of Illinois. And so 75% of the population in Illinois actually lives within the Chicago metro area. And so we can keep zooming in, and we can zoom in even further. We can start looking at cities. You'll notice Glen Ellen is not marked on there. If you look along the line between, I'm really close to Wheaton, and we'll take a look at transportation systems, the role that that plays. But part of why we ended up there is because of those transportation lines, because of the schools, and so we're going to fit all of that into our story today. So I'm also a little bit country, and so I can't wait to do our agriculture reviews with you. I grew up in a small town in Wisconsin, 1,000 people. I now teach in a school that has 2,400 students. So how could I go from a town of 1,000 to living in 28,000, a school that's 2,400 people? Part of that has to do with types of jobs that we do, things that we're looking for our children. My husband builds high rises. And at the end of the day, probably weren't going to build a lot of high rises in rural northern Wisconsin. Now, is it a place I love to go vacation? Absolutely. But if we're going to talk about raising our kids and we talk about things that my husband's career, this is what offers more for our family. So, been a lot of change over the last 100 and some years when we talk about urban growth. So there's a few vocab words that we want to make sure that you're exposed to. So when we talk about urban sprawl, that unrestricted growth, housing, commercial development, roads over large expanse of land. And so when we look at Chicago, for example, we can see in 1900, you can definitely see it clustered along the lake shore. So some of you are probably sitting here like, why do I need to know about Chicago? Chicago is not going to be on the test. So Chicago mirrors a lot of the things that other cities are experiencing or have experienced. And so this is what I know from firsthand experience, and I want to just be able to share that story with you. When we take a look at Chicago, we see it developing along the lakeshore, we're looking for those patterns, and I know Ms. Lindsley talked a lot about that yesterday. We take a look at, I could probably even find some, if I'm where rail lines actually are developing today, major highways, in how we can move people. This is 1900, and we start to see people moving closer to the city, but then also then pushing out. And part of that has to do with, we can only hold so many, and we take a look at here in 2005. And so then we also start looking at is, where are these people going and why are they going there? Why not stay in the city if the city has everything to offer? Well, part is land cost, part is people want space, and part is people want other opportunities. And so what we started to see is this development of suburbanization. So what we saw is the upper middle class people moving from the urban core to the surrounding outskirts. Today, what we'll probably see, you'll see some trends here. This was actually some Chicago trend analysis, that we tend to see a decrease in people leaving the city of Chicago, but an increase into the inner suburbs, so different rings, and then the outer suburbs, and we'll talk about the exurbs in just a little bit. But those outer suburbs, this is where people are really looking for space. They're looking for space, they're looking for schools, they're looking for, in their mind, more a decrease probably in crime. They're looking for more of a community feel. And so one of those things, though, at what cost? So this is an aerial shot, and you can see definitely the development of those neighborhoods. You can see, though, where there's some farmland. And part of the draw here, too, is that open space, but the more that move out there, we end up losing a lot of that farmland. I'm hoping if my students are listening right now, that they see those grid systems that they've tried to that are starting to disappear, but if we kept flying, they might remember that phrase township and range and how the land was divided up as we moved westward. I love Google Earth. If you ever get an opportunity to play around on Google Earth, I highly recommend it. So one of our largest suburbs in the Chicagoland area is Naperville. A little shout out if you guys are listening. And Naperville is a highly respected community. You'll see the interstate, I-88 here, centered around a downtown. And so that idea of having a small downtown and trying to really create that small town feel, you'll see parks, you'll see places you'll see schools. If we zoom in even a little bit further, Naperville is pretty interesting too. You'll find community elementary schools. You'll find suburbs or subdivisions that are typically centered around a little clubhouse or a pool, trying to kind of bring those communities together. We zoom in even closer. This one you can see is centered around a golf course. If you've never done this, it's a really fascinating, zoom into pick them any major city in the world and zoom in and try and find their golf course. When we talk about globalization, when we talk about growth, you're going to typically find a golf course in major cities. It's a place for business. It's a place for relaxation and entertainment. But it's interesting on how different areas will let their homes and their housing developments be developed around there. So I mentioned this idea of the exurbs, and those exurbs, what we're taking a look at are those prosperous residential districts beyond the burbs. So this is kind of I would say, a newer term that we're starting to track a little bit more. We've seen this, I mean, you can see here they started tracking in 1900 and it hasn't, it stayed pretty small for quite a while, but part of that is because when we take a look at access to transportation, connectivity. I mean, the fact that you're even watching online right now, I mean, is part of that. Where we see some of the fastest exurb growth is actually in Los Angeles, New York City. These are people that typically are wanting not even, I'm just going to show you, not even this type of neighborhood. They're wanting even more space. And so what allows them to do that? Variety of transportation options and that ability to telecommute. Okay, so what do you need to take away from all this? Because here's this crazy lady talking at me. Urban sprawl isn't just happening in Chicago. Urban sprawl is happening across the globe. But what we're really talking about is happening in MDCs. So the difference here is between urbanization, so that rural to urban movement, we are seeing global. We're going to come back to that. Urban sprawl, what we're talking about here is that once we've established it, then that choice of moving outward. So for example, take a look at the most sprawling metropolitan areas in the United States. It's a pretty good chance or possibility that some of you that are listening live in one of these regions. If you've ever driven through some of these, you're like, yeah, it just feels like it's city upon city upon city. I was doing a little bit of reading about the Riverside, San Bernardino, metropolitan region. What's interesting about that one is that you could be close to 200 miles away from that urban core. That to me is interesting from the standpoint you wouldn't consider that your home base. So at what cost? We're taking away all of this land, but then what else has to develop as we're moving throughout this area? My dog apparently decided to come and join us, so I apologize. So one of the things that we take a look at though is how do you keep up? Like think how big that Riverside metropolitan region is. How do you keep up? And so what's happening are these boom burbs. So these are rapidly growing suburban cities that represent a new metropolitan form. So take a look at this list. So as you're writing down a definition, as you're listening to this, where do you notice that most of these cities are? Phoenix, LA, San Diego, San Francisco. Where we see the largest boom burbs taking place, we see them in that Southwest region. Now you're going to say, crazy lady, what about Chicago? What about Seattle? So it's happening in other places, but we're seeing a lot in that Southwest region. And part of why we're seeing it is that climate is a big draw, business is a big draw, but we can't keep up with the building. So in the core, what we're finding with these boom burbs is that they're lacking the central city. So as they're developing, it's kind of just like housing developments upon housing developments. Then there's going to be strip malls. There's going to be people upon people. So the resources will be there, but what's not going to be there is necessarily that small town community feel. I like in my suburb, I walk about 4 blocks and I'm in downtown Glen Ellen. And I can go to the Starbucks when it's open and I can grab, I like white hot chocolate, so I can grab a drink with my friends. I can then go walk. We've got a little cute theater, or I can just walk through the downtown, but typically I'm saying hi to a lot of people. In the boom burbs, you're not gonna feel that same walkability. You're gonna drive to a lot of those things. We also see with boom burbs a ton of traffic congestion. We see more urban sprawl, so taking over of that farmland and that open space. The access to resources still have to be there, and so how do we accommodate? And oftentimes what we see develop are edge cities. So what's an edge city? Well, crazy. It's an economic center on the fringe of a city. Extensive amount of office and retail space, typically near a major road. That's the key. I need you to know edge cities are going to develop along those major interstates. So I'm going to use one that's near and dear, close, partly because I've been there many times, and it's Rosemont, Illinois. So on this, you can see our major interstates. Here's 90, here's 294, here's 190. This is O'Hare Airport is going to be over here. So I drive by this area when I'm going to drop people off at the airport, or if I'm going to go on a trip. Not now, obviously, but hopefully again in the future. But right now, when I drive by and I drive by this area that's been built up in Rosemont, it has a lot of the same things that I would find in downtown Chicago. A lot of the restaurants, activities, the prime outlets, so I can do some shopping for our sport fans. There's the Big Ten headquarters are located right there, but it's that idea of easy on, easy off access. And so I don't have to go all the way into the city, that a lot of those resources are right there. So that idea of the edge city, again, it's on the fringe. We're going to find office and retail space near major roads. So how does that connect to other things that we've learned? When we start talking about development and we start talking about interconnectivity, how do we maintain that interconnectivity as we're moving outside of our norm? Okay, so it's a lot of talk about Chicago, a lot of talk about the United States. So we do need to probably talk a little bit about what's happening around the world. So as I mentioned, there's a ton of rural to urban movement across the globe. Why? If you said in your head, it's where the jobs are, the resources are located, they're not making it on the farms, those are the right answers. You're pulling people into these cities. But what happens when they get there? And so we're going to see different things at different locations in different countries. So the first thing that I want to do is talk about some definitions. And I apologize that my face is covering some of the definitions here. I will work on that for future presentations. So megacities. Megacities, we're talking more than 10 million residents. Metacities, we're talking over 20 million. At the end of the day, these are huge cities, but they didn't just spring up over time. So I'm going to pause for a second, and I'm going to, if you can get access to a blank map, or you want to just create a list, that's fine as well, and practice mapping later. I'm kind of stalling if you wanted to do that, but I would say that having a blank map and practicing some mapping skills is going to be helpful for this next little bit. I need to work on some music. So if you were able to find a map, because I'm sure all of your teachers have them handy for you, because we ask you to map all the time. What we're going to do is we're going to go through a series of the 10 most populous cities. We're going to look at 3 different time periods. So part of why we're looking at 1975 is because I was born in 1975. That's where you're all supposed to laugh or groan. But out of all seriousness, it is one of our times when we're checking doubling time over the course of history. This is when we hit one of those markers. And so it is one of those time periods where some of you are probably saying this is around my age of my parents, that this is kind of, we're going to see some rapid growth. The doubling time is starting to pick up. So this is why we're using that out of all seriousness. So these are the top 10 cities in 1975. Now notice, I did not put the countries after each city. Why? Because you need to start to be able to mental map. You need to be able to look at Tokyo and go, Japan. What do I know about Japan? New York City, the United States. What do I know about the United States? So what we're going to do is we're going to actually, I did this on Notability, and I went through and I labeled them, and I labeled them 3 different times. And so I'm going to walk you through it. We're going to do a kind of, what do you see? What are some trends? Because what I ultimately, by the end of the course of the 3 of these series of maps, what I want you to be able to see is how things have changed drastically from 1975 to the projected numbers that we're going to look at in 2030. So 1975, I'm using this lovely pink color. And so as we said, we marked, I'm going to find my cheat sheet here. We did Tokyo first. And so when we look at Tokyo, Japan, we talked about New York City, and then also Shanghai, looking at China. Now, when you look at all 3 of those, if you were able to zoom in, you would see that they're on the coast. Yesterday, when you were talking with Miss Lindsley, you were talking about sight. Why the coast? Okay, so what's there? I always find it interesting when I go to the 4th and you go to Mexico City. It's located inland. Why? What problems could that present? Yet at the same time, why is it ranked 4th in 1975? We go back to the coast. We look at Sao Paulo, Brazil, Osaka. Now, if we're a student in my class, you're probably going, Mrs. Brandt, you've never talked about Osaka. But in 1975, one of the top 10 largest cities in the United States, or in the world, sorry, in the world. Buenos Aires, Argentina, another coastal city. Got to bring LA in there. Paris, France, and Beijing, China. Just take a minute to look at this map. Take a look at kind of where they're situated across the globe. Take a look at, are they in MDCs? Are they in LDCs? Okay, well, let's see what happens. So we are going to jump to the year 2000, 25 years later, and you should notice some changes. Take a look. Mexico City jumped from 4 to 1. Tokyo down to 3. Sao Paulo. Wait a second, in 25 years, we've added Calcutta, Mumbai, and Delhi. Your flag should be going off going, wait a second, they're in the same country. New York City still remain. Seoul, how did that end up in there? Shanghai, Rio de Janeiro. So let's take a look at our map, and then we'll talk just a little bit as we're going through this. So take a look at what came off the list. Okay, came off the list: LA, Paris, Beijing, Osaka, and Buenos Aires. So why? What's going on? Well, part in Mexico City, we take a look at higher birth rates. We take a look at people moving to their center point, that this is where their government is centered. We take a look at Sao Paulo, continues to grow along that coastline. We'll look at some problems here in just a second with that. Tokyo, and you might be going, how did Osaka move off the list? Osaka is still one of the largest cities in the world. I will say it gets difficult sometimes when we're in your political unit of where are those lines and those boundaries, depending on how we're defining at the time, that are they kind of a continuous area? But we would say it's still ranked extremely high. It just is clearly not at the same level as Delhi. Take a look here at India. We're going to put in Delhi, Mumbai, Calcutta, New York City stayed, Seoul, Shanghai. We had Rio de Janeiro just north of Sao Paulo, and Delhi. Okay, now you should see, for those of you that are looking, you're probably going, Mrs. Brandt, boy, those BRICS countries are kind of dominating. Look at there, we've got Brazil, we've got India, we've got China. And so when we're really looking as far as where is that development occurring, they are occurring. Think about your stages of development. These are your countries that are shifting to stage 3 and really trying to move to stage 4 along that demographic transition model. So let's take a look at some projections. And so when I look at some projections, this comes from the World Economic Forum. I'm not going to lie, when I was researching this, you find different projections all the time, and I guess that's just it. Remember, when we talk about data collection and we talk about projections, there's some statistical margin of error. There's no way that we can count every single person, although please tell me, this is a little PSA for all of you in the United States, that it is the census time. Make sure your families are completing theirs so we can have as accurate a count as possible. But out of all seriousness, there are sometimes some some flaws in our calculations. But again, projection, most had all of these cities on every time I was looking at different sources. So it jumps back up there as Tokyo. I'm sure your teachers have talked about the density of Tokyo, talked about my students love the people pushers, that image of the train, and we're putting people on the train trying to move to and from. They also love like the little kind of tubes that people are staying in because of the long hours that the hotels. But take a look at Delhi, Mumbai, that growth just continues in India. Hopefully you talked about population strategies when you were looking at India. When we review population in a couple weeks, we'll talk more about that. But that idea of education, that idea of, so how do we slow that growth? Shanghai continues to be a major port, and that's going to pull people into those areas. When we talk about, but you're going to see we added Dhaka, Karachi, Cairo, Lagos. So let's take a look and we'll talk when we look at the map here. So you'll notice that the United States came off the list. You're noticing that even look at South America came off the list. If you notice, I wish you could see my fingers like go across the band, but it just seems like we're really staying along that Tropic of Cancer region of our cities. And so Tokyo remains on the list, and that is, it's become that technological hub. It's going to move goods in and out, and if you're a mover and shaker in Japan, it's where you're going to live. We look at Shanghai and Delhi. Again, Shanghai, we talked about the port. Delhi, that center point for India. Mumbai is a cultural hub. It's a port as well. My students, we like talking about the entertainment industry of Mumbai as well. Beijing, the government, the political center. We added in Dhaka in Bangladesh. And so we'll talk more about, when we get to development, talk more about some of the poverty issues, some of the struggles within Bangladesh. We add in Pakistan and Karachi. We add in Cairo along the Nile River. We add in Lagos in Nigeria. And so we talk a lot about Nigeria and creating those islands of development, creating these center points for business, for people to come to, but transnational corporations to come in and move their goods in and out. And Mexico City stays on the list. Mexico City continues to grow at really high rates. And one of the problems that it's dealing with is pollution. And when we're taking a look at, it kind of gets trapped by the mountains. And so how does it continue to develop, but also deal with some of those environmental concerns? And that's actually a pretty good segue to when we start looking at some of the problems that are going to occur. Why do we look at that? You know, this comes from the United Nations, and we start talking about the distribution of the world's urban population. You know, we take a look at how many people are moving to cities. There's a lot of good things that can come from moving to cities. When we take a look at access to healthcare, to food, to jobs, we know that if we're going to help lift up a country from being from the periphery, from those less developed countries, that really this is where you need to be as far as kind of advancing and giving people opportunities. But it comes at a cost. So even in core areas, it comes at a cost. It comes at a cost of losing our farmland. It comes at a cost of congestion. I don't know how many of your parents maybe spend hours and hours commuting. It comes at a cost of rent prices. Those of you living in California or New York City, I know that you hear a lot about this. You know, we talk, you know, why is California housing so unaffordable? So you can see a list here. But how do we make this so that people can continue to work and live in those areas? So in the United States, or in MDCs, we're pretty fortunate. We're trying to build better transportation systems. Those edge cities are developing. We've got systems in place. We've got government structures where eminent domain, where sometimes it's not easy, but if this is where if we're going to help the greater good, taking over some of that land. In the semi-periphery, this is in Brazil. And we take a look at that center point around, you know, we'll see the city, that urban center, but then growing out here, they're going to grow into the mountains. And so if you remember the Olympics and Rio, what you saw was a lot of looking at the favelas and looking at moving up into the mountains and how this housing upon housing, and so really that lack of space was occurring. One of the things that we also take a look at is crime rates in those really crowded areas, the living conditions in the semi-periphery. So in that, I would say those BRICS countries, that it's really creating, they're obviously at a better position than when I show you the periphery next, but they're still going to struggle with that rapid growth. How do you keep up? And that's where we really see in the periphery. And then what we see in the periphery is this huge contrast between the haves versus have-nots. You know, take a look in the background of this urban area and then trying to build your home out of just about anything so that you can just have access to that city, access to those resources, while there's other places that clearly are doing okay. And it's frustrating. You know, take a look at the streets, take a look at how crowded they are. If you can spend some time later today and look at the inner cities or look at the cities, I love looking at India and looking at Mumbai and Calcutta and looking at the growth, looking at the slums, but also the beautiful culture that's developing within there, but the struggles of how do we have access to clean water? How do we have access to our sanitation? How do we have that infrastructure is not in place? I did a mission trip about 10, 15 years ago, and I will just say I did that, but I served in an area where they did not have access to clean water. And so the trucks would bring the water And it became very difficult to function if you don't have access to those resources. And so things that a lot of us take for granted, the fact we're sitting here on your phone, your iPad, your computer, and you're watching this, the difficulties that other people are having when they're talking about just the access to those basic necessities makes it a little bit difficult to, how do we develop them? And because you've got to take care of those basic needs first.